Well, we lived in apartments until my mother and father bought the house on First East. And in half the house, Lorraine Thorpe, her two brothers and mother and father lived in, and in the other half of the house, we lived. And so Lorraine and I were close from the time we were 5 years old. And we went to the church on Center Street, the one that they have refurbished. And I got to shake the hand of Heber J. Grant when he dedicated the building. Because my mother was in the primary at the time, and let's see, there used to be, and by the way, we're right next door. We were right next door to your grandma and grandpa Sumption.
Oh, really?
And Dan Sumption lived with them. And I remember them very well. It was an interesting... But the Thorpes, my mother and Mrs. Thorpe gathered eggs for the lady that owned the house. And Lorraine and I had to go help. And I didn't mind if the chicken was off the roost, but if it was on the roost, I'd tell Lorraine she had to do it. But we gathered eggs and got them ready for the market by washing them well and putting them in cartons. And then my parents bought the house on First East in Springville, and that was great because it was close enough to walk to town. And we didn't have a car. Had a bicycle. But my father used to do anything to earn money. He liked to keep busy. And one day when he went with the water master to dig ditch, I thought, what's the matter? My family doesn't have to do that, do they? But everyone did, and they did what they could to earn money. And when they bought the house on First East, they were so thrilled. And that's where my brother Paul was born. But I think the price of it was $3,800. And when my grandpa Lee, that's my mother's father, when he passed away, she inherited some money and they finished paying off the house. That was their goal, was to get that house paid for. It was just 2 bedrooms, a bath, a kitchen, and a half a basement with a furnace. But we had a lot of fun. We had a lot of parties there because my parents had always been people that liked to play cards and liked to have company. And I lived there until your Grandpa Fletcher and I were married in 46 or 47, I can't remember which now. But when he came back from the war and we got married, I had lived with my parents all the time he was in the war.
Good. Now, did your father always do freelance work, or did he own a shop? Or
No, the reason he dug ditch for the city was because every spring the water master hired a few men to help him clear out the ditches so the water would run freely. And the water master happened to be my uncle. He was a brother to Grandma Charrington. So he gave him a job helping him. But he still had a job with the state fish and game.
Oh, okay. What was that job for? What was that? What did he do?
He would load up with baby fish in this tank truck that kept the water running and those fish alive and drive to St. George. And sometimes he'd go, well, I guess St. George was about the furthest, but he'd go to Schofield and St. George and all these places that, so they'd be ready for the spring, because people used to fish an awfully lot. And he worked for the state fish and game, delivering these fish in this big tank truck. Sometimes I'd get to go with him.
Really?
I thought that was great. And my mother went with him to St. George because she was afraid he'd sleep on the way back because he'd go down and back in one day.
Wow. So would he sometimes take you fishing out there?
I never did like fish, and so I didn't eat fish at all, uh, but he used to catch some pretty good fish.
Good.
They ate a lot of fish. They always had fish on Friday, because he'd bring them one from the hatchery if they didn't have any. Of course, they didn't have freezers, so you ate what was available.
You talked a little bit about Lorraine. Did you keep in contact with her throughout your life, or what was your relationship
Yeah,
with
we
Lorraine?
went through school clear from kindergarten. And in about sixth grade, we started to think about the boys, and we'd meet them in front of the theater downtown on Saturday and go to the movie with them.
Oh, really?
In fact, the last class reunion I was to, the fellow I first dated was Jay Grant, and he says, "Do you remember when I kissed you on the front porch and I was afraid your dad was coming out that door?" I said, "I know you kissed me and ran." But the boys by that time were able to drive, and many of them drove, I know, without a license, but they could do it to help their parents on the farm. Or most of them in Springville had some farm ground or things that the boys would do. Well, they taught them how to drive.
Did you learn how to drive from your dad eventually?
My dad took me in the West Fields where he would go. He was a game warden for the state fish and game, and he'd go down and catch poachers that were killing pheasants and deer and whatever was there, and I went with him quite a bit.
Can you tell us a little bit about that story, about what happened with him? And
Well, Mr. Harward called him, who owned a lot of property down there. His son does now, and that's where all these Harward stands come from, with tomatoes and things in the summer. But anyway, he called him and said there was shooting in the West Field. Someone was poaching pheasants in his fields. And so my father said he'd take care of it, and he got in the car and went to the West Fields. And when he picked them up and put the pheasants in the trunk for proof and whatnot, he leaned over and he started to have a heart attack, and they drove off and left him instead of helping him. And when he didn't come home, my grandma was really concerned about him, or my mother. And so she called the hatchery down. There was a fish hatchery here in town, down on Main Street. She called the man that ran that hatchery and told him he hadn't come home when he looked for him in Westfields, and about the phone call he'd gotten from Mr. Harward. So he went down and found him and got him to the hospital.
Interesting.
But there's quite an article. I think your dad has a copy of it, and a story about two men that should be proud for leaving someone in.
Need someone there in that condition. Can you tell us a little bit about your parents and a little bit about maybe your mother? We've kind of talked about your dad and how he worked with the fishing and.
Yeah, my mother was a hard worker. She was the cleanest person, though. She'd had a fit after I got married, and they'd come into my house and see how I kept house. She said, "You weren't taught that way." And I says, "I know, but I'm different than you." It wouldn't be messy like this is. Everything had a place. But she was taught that way, and her parents were very strict. She lived in Mapleton in a great big house that Grandpa built because they had 12 children. And she was the youngest girl at home, so she had to iron all these shirts for her brothers. And her dad felt sorry for her. So he did anything to help her out. And she and Daddy had a lot of parties. They liked to play cards, and they liked to have parties, and had a lot of friends
Mm-hmm.
that would come, and on Saturday, every Saturday night, they'd play cards at one of these friends or at our house.
Hmm.
And she belonged to a ladies' club that played 500, the card game 500. And I was always hoping that one of them would call. They'd have lunch and then play cards in the afternoon, and I was always hoping that one of them would call sick so I could play cards with them. That's how I learned to play 500.
What other card games would they play?
Well, that was about all my parents played, but we used to play, if we had a party, we played Monopoly or Canasta or oh, there's a lot of them.
Hmm.
We'd have a lot of fun playing cards and games.
Hmm.
Monopoly. On Sunday afternoon while the war was on and all of our husbands were gone, our friends would all get together at one of our homes and play Monopoly.
Hmm.
And it would extend from one Sunday to another. It was kept us busy.
Would your mother ever work to help support? Or?
No, she didn't. She was just a homemaker, so that when my father died, she knew she wanted to go to work to keep busy. So she worked at a place called Chicken Inn, and it was down on 1400 North. There's a Bandito pizza place or something there now, but it was called the Chicken Inn. And she went down there and helped them serve. No, she didn't serve. She was in the kitchen. And then a man by the name of Jacobson came to town and wanted a bookkeeper for his upholstery store. And we rented Grandma Fletcher's house to him until he could get his house built or until he bought one. And so I was asking him about his shop and that, and he said, did I know anyone he could get for a bookkeeper? I thought, gosh, my mother's really good at that. That'd get her out of that restaurant. So I told her to go talk to him, and she worked there for several years until he went out of business, in fact.
Hmm. So what was, if we talk a little bit about Grandpa Fletcher, what was it like your courtship before he went off to war, before you guys were married?
Oh, well, in about the 10th grade, I think I dated him a couple of times in the 10th. We used to have big school dances. One would be the Ag Club Ball, and one would be the Art Ball, and there were a lot of formal dances. And you can wear the same formal twice, so you had to do it over or get another one or loan it to somebody and you'd wear theirs or something. But anyway, the dances were great. And in about the 10th grade, I started dating him. And he had a group of friends, which included the Stewarts and Johnsons. And of course, I was in a group of girls of 10. And we called ourselves, I can't remember for sure. It was an LLL club anyway, and we had dresses alike. We had LLL on our dresses. We'd all wear them to school the same day.
What did that stand for, LLL?
Live, love, and learn.
Hmm.
That was it.
Hmm.
And at that stage, we were only interested in learning about love, I can tell you. We had to talk over. And I saw Grandpa at least 3 or 4 times a week.
Really? Did you both live in Springville?
Mm-hmm. He lived on 7th South, and he grew up in a grocery store. His father owned a grocery store with gas pumps out in front, and then another gas station on the way to Thistle, and then another gas station on Center Street in Springville,
Mm-hmm.
where they built the new library. That was his corner.
Hmm.
He was a very Good businessman.
So you guys dated in 10th grade,
Mhm.
and then what happened after that?
Well, the 4 girls and 4 boys kind of stuck together. But Floyd Stewart was the oldest of the Stewart brothers, and he wanted to date Lorraine all the time, and she was going with Sonny Crandall. So he already had a date for the Ag Club ball once, and he had already asked this other girl to go, but he wanted to take Lorraine. So he told Reed he had to take the other girl. That meant I didn't have a date. Never did forgive him for that. But I got a date with Alan Danielson, and I went to the dance, but I danced nearly every dance with Reed. We had programs, and you'd fill out who you were going to dance with on the programs.
So his name showed up the
It was a
most.
fun time. And then the 4 couples would go on a picnic or go sleigh riding in the West Fields, or we'd do something every Sunday. And one time we went to Birdseye, which is on the way to, well, the town that got flooded out. What was it over there? Oh. Anyway, we'd go down that road and make a kind of a circle from here down through Sanpete County and back. And they were in the habit of seeing if there were any pheasants that they could shoot when pheasant season opened. But they shot some and put them in the trunk that Sunday. And I said, I just won't go in the house. My dad's a game warden, and I won't go in the house with those pheasants in the trunk, so drop them off before you take me home. But he didn't do it. And when we got home, I wanted to go tell my dad they had pheasants in the trunk, but I didn't dare. And then a few days later, we all went to his mother's place on 7th South Main Street in Springville, and she went to Salt Lake. She was up to Salt Lake a lot, so she was gone, and he was the one that had most of the parties. But the men cleaned the pheasants, and they had a pheasant dinner for us. I never did tell my dad.
So, you and Grandpa, you guys dated through the 10th grade, had many fun experiences. How old were you when you started to date him more seriously and then talking about possibly marriage?
Oh, by the end of the 11th year, in high school, we were pretty serious. All 4 of us, and we stuck together. We did everything together, the 4 of us. We went deer hunting, we went state fair, we went everywhere together.
What were the names of these 4 couples?
Blaine Johnson and Alma Miner, Alan Stewart and Dorothy Waite, and Lorraine Thorpe and Briggs Stewart. There were the 2 brothers, and then Blaine and Grandpa.
So, once you guys started to seriously talk about getting married, I forgot, did you guys get married before or after he went to war?
He was gone 13 months before he got a furlough. Most of them got one sooner, but he didn't. And the first time he got a furlough, we got married in the Salt Lake Temple. Then he went back to Tennessee, and I was able to go there for 2 weeks before he was shipped overseas.
Where was he shipped to first, do you know?
Philippines.
The Philippines? And how long was it that you had to wait for him to come back?
Well, let's see, we were married in 44, and he's gone 3 years.
Wow.
It was 47. End of 46, I guess, when he came back. 47.
What was his position in the army? Was he a combat officer?
Yes, he was the gunner on an anti-aircraft gun. And he sent a picture of it. And it had great, huge doors on it. And he said when the Japanese weren't bombing them and when they didn't need the anti-aircraft going, he'd put his arms over these two doors and sleep. And if the siren sounded, he'd have to very quickly get the gun up to shoot the Japanese planes. And it was called an anti-aircraft. I don't know. Anyway, he had a good friend in the service, but he was the only one that was west of the Mississippi, so life was a little bit different than he had been used to, and they all smoked and they all drank, and he had a good friend whose father was a senator in New York, and your grandpa couldn't figure out why he got in the war. His father could have kept him out, but anyway, he sold to Mr. Emmett, was his name, all the cigarettes and all the beer that they'd be handed out to the soldiers. All the cigarette companies made addicts out of all the soldiers that they could, and they'd hand out little packages of free cigarettes, or they could buy them without any tax, which was cheap. So all that was given to your dad or your grandpa was sold to Mr. Emmett Gone, because he was a drinker and he was a smoker, and so all the money he made while he was in the army he'd send home.
Oh.
He wrote about how the Filipino ladies did their laundry and how nice they were to them.
Okay. Just a second.